Warning: your skeleton is not your own. The drill stops mid-bite. A sterile femur, prepped, scrubbed, textbook, leaks a faint shimmer, and a tech murmurs, "There's life in there." 5 minutes later, fluorescence maps bacterial signatures along bone canals everyone swore were empty rock. The surgeon backs up. If bone isn't sterile, what else are we wrong about? Bones aren't quiet scaffolds. Multiple labs now detect microbial DNA, and in rare, carefully controlled cases, signs consistent with activity inside healthy bone and marrow. If those whispers help set density and healing, blasting them blindly could backfire. Tonight, we follow the lever that flips build to dissolve, and why a tiny colony might hold your frame's throttle. Roadmap and rules of the game. Welcome to Freaky Science. 3 promises: paradox, proof, payoff. The paradox is uncomfortable. Your skeleton behaves like a habitat, co-managed by ancient microbes nested in marrow niches and microchannels, while the louder choir in your gut conducts from a distance. The proof is careful. Low biomass sequencing with ruthless controls, orthogonal imaging, germ-free animal work, and human signals that line up with immune mechanics. The payoff is practical. Stronger bones, faster healing, smarter implants, better timing for antibiotics and training. Ground rules. First, facts only. We'll separate what's verified from what's likely and flag open questions. No invented quotes, dates, or miracle numbers. Second, terms we'll actually use. Osteoblast build. Osteoclast demolish. The switchboard is immune. Rankle tells osteoclast to mature. OPG is the decoy that soaks rankle and says stand down. Microbes speak in molecules. Short-chain fatty acids like butyrate and propionate, bits of cell wall, DNA fragments, that immune cells read through toll-like and now D receptors. Change that reading, you change bone. About that 10%. We're not claiming a tenth of your bone mass is microbes. We're saying a small microbial footprint can exert outsized control through metabolites and immune tone that bias the rankle to OPG ratio. Tiny levers, big consequences. Here's how we'll travel. We'll rewind to the lab moments that cracked the sterile bone belief. Signals that persisted after skin scrubs, air plate shadows, and reagent blanks, plus rare imaging that dotted bones' canaliculi with life-consistent markers. Then we sit at the marrow switchboard and watch microbial products tilt T cells and B cells toward either fueling osteoclasts or giving osteoblasts room. You'll see how fiber-fed butyrate raises regulatory tone, dampens osteoclastogenesis, and primes builders. From there, the gut-bone axis, diet, antibiotics, and specific strains in animals that shift density when estrogen drops. While human trials remind us strain identity and context matter. We'll step inside the fortress and ask whether locals live near osteocyte intercoms. Evidence is emerging, sparse, and rigor-bound. Next, fracture healing as choreography. Sterile inflammation, vascular growth, callus, all tuned by postbiotics that coach macrophages toward repair when the timing's right. Hormones set tempo, puberty, pregnancy, menopause, while microbes decide whether those shifts land as music or noise. Aging turns the background up. Fewer short-chain fatty acids, more smoldering inflammation, tilted resorption, and levers you can still pull. When collaboration fails, we split fire from thermostat. True infections like osteomyelitis demand aggression. Dysbiosis demands tone repair. Then implants meet ecology, surfaces that court osteoblasts while giving pathogens no foothold, and stewardship that protects healing cues. We'll cut hype from hard lines, sketch the next trials that could change guidelines, and end with a no-drama daily protocol. One open loop. The lever is a ratio. Rankle to OPG. Written by immune cells trained by microbes. Find how to tune it safely, and you change how bones age, break, and rebuild. Breaking the sterile myth. To understand why the drill stopped, we need to go back to the first clean controls that refused to be quiet. A hematology team ran routine sequencing on marrow aspirates from healthy donors. Bacterial DNA showed up where textbooks promised nothing. First instinct, contamination. They rebuilt the protocol from the floor up. Double skin preps, sealed needles, single-use drills, air plates open beside the field, and reagent blanks riding every step. The signal shrank, but it didn't die. Proteobacteria, Actinobacteria. Not a bloom, just a whisper that wouldn't leave. Stakes land fast. If sterile bone is a myth, you don't just worry about infections. You rethink remodeling. Osteoblasts and osteoclasts do their work inches from immune cells listening for microbial cues. If quiet residents sit in microchannels, then antibiotics, implants, even diet could be nudging density without anyone seeing the hand on the lever. Overtreat noise and you might silence the guidance system that keeps bone steady. Proof in low biomass biology is unforgiving. Teams layered methods, 16 srRNA amplicon sequencing to flag who might be there. Shotgun metagenomics to sharpen the picture and subtract known contaminants. Orthogonal detection to get beyond DNA fragments. In a subset of carefully handled bone shavings and marrow-adjacent cores, fluorescence in situ hybridization with ribosomal probes lit up tiny punctate-tracing, canal-like paths. Live, dead dyes suggested membranes intact in a few clusters. Confocal stacks mapped dots lining the lacuno-canalicular network, the same tunnels where osteocytes sense strain and pass messages. Meanwhile, skeptics aimed where they should. Skin flora sneaks in, drills aerosolize, post-mortem bones get colonized, reagent kits are dirty. So labs escalated. Samples moved into sterile isolators. Ultra-pure ancient DNA kits replaced standard reagents. Negative controls outnumbered samples. Some signals vanished under that pressure, which mattered. The ones that stayed began to look real. Across sites, the same lean phyla popped up in bone more than in blanks, and spatial mapping showed pockets, denser near marrow sinusoids and osteocyte neighborhoods than at the outer cortex. A micro-story captured the moment the myth cracked in practice. During an elective hip replacement, a surgeon handed off a cortical slice to a research tech who ran a rapid fluorogenic assay for bacterial enzymes as a curiosity check. It popped. They re-prepped, switched instruments, sampled a second site, and ran matched blanks. Pop again. Controls were dark, no fevers, no lytic lesions, no clinical infection, just a signal sitting where no one expected a voice. But DNA isn't life. Culture was the next hill, and it mostly failed. That wasn't surprising. If tenants exist, they're likely slow growers, adapted to mineral and low oxygen. So teams asked a different question. Activity. RNA-scope probes targeting bacterial rRNA signaled in a handful of marrow-adjacent canals when tissues were snapped into RNase inhibitors within seconds. Nanosims and Raman microscopy found tiny chemical halos, subtle mineral-to-matrix shifts and lactate signatures that fit low-level metabolism. Not decay, not disease, just life doing the bare minimum in a hard place. Parallel animal work tightened the frame. Germ-free mice, no microbes anywhere, carried skewed immune profiles and abnormal bone features that normalized when colonized with communities that ferment fiber. Add butyrate and propionate to the mix, and you watch T cells cool, osteoclastogenesis ease, and osteoblast markers climb. Even if bone's locals were sparse, the body's microbial orchestra clearly reached the skeleton. That gave the human whispers a plausible microphone. Immune cells in marrow translating microbial products into the Rankel and OPG ratio that decides build versus dissolve. Clinicians needed a line they could use on Monday morning. Was every faint read a hidden infection? No. Osteomyelitis still announces itself with pain, swelling, systemic signs, lab jumps, and imaging that can't hide lytic bites or sequestra. The low biomass signals in quiet bone were different, stable, sparse, and often sitting near osteocyte intercoms without clinical heat. The emerging position in careful circles. We're not looking at a city, we're mapping a hamlet. Residents and some people, some of the time, living near the wires. Contamination remained the dragon. One dirty kit can invent an ecosystem. That's why the field now demands dossiers. Negative controls processed alongside samples, multiple primer sets, orthogonal imaging, and when possible, RNA stabilization. Studies without that scaffolding don't move the needle. Studies with it have started to align. The same lean phyla, the same spatial bias, the same pattern of persistence across months in repeated biopsies from the same niche. The impact was immediate in thinking, slower in policy. Orthopedic teams didn't stop sterilizing instruments or shorten prophylaxis for contaminated trauma, but they did start asking whether every extended antibiotic course after clean procedures made sense if the goal was to protect healing cues. Implant researchers leaned into surfaces that coax macrophages toward pro-repair phenotypes without handing pathogens a foothold. Immunologists showed up at orthopedic conferences to talk rankle, OPG, and T-cell subsets like they were hardware specs. Meanwhile, another question sharpened. Are these locals doing work, or are they just tolerated? The best clues came from edges of fractures and elective biopsies, where imaging flagged activity and probes glowed in canals. Early callus sometimes formed cleaner, and turnover markers leaned toward formation. Correlation isn't causation, and no one called it proof, but the pattern was enough to justify the next acts. Sit at the marrow board, follow the gut wire, and test whether tuning microbial tone can safely nudge the ratio that runs the skeleton. This was the conceptual flip. Bone wasn't an inert being you protect from the world. It was an immune-literate tissue that expects quiet microbial coaching. Once you see the scaffold as a habitat, with intercoms, tenants, and hall monitors, you can't unsee it. And that sends us to the switchboard, where the voices get translated into structure. The switchboard. Immune crosstalk controls bone. Follow the whisper to the room where decisions get made. A few millimeters from osteoblasts and osteoclast precursors, T cells, B cells, and macrophages run a 2-dial panel, Rankin L and OPG. Rankin says mature the demolishers. OPG soaks up Rankin and tells them to wait. Tilt that ratio, and you tilt the month's construction report. More resorption or more formation. It isn't abstract biochemistry, it's payroll. Microbes don't phone the board directly, they send molecules. Short-chain fatty acids from gut fermentation, especially butyrate and propionate, slip into blood, cross into marrow, and change who's sitting at the console. Bits of cell wall and DNA fragments do it too, through pattern recognition hardware on immune cells and even on bone lineage cells. Toll-like receptors, nod receptors. Low, rhythmic inputs tend to coach calm. Chaotic surges light the resorption lamp. Watch a clean sequence play out. Feed fermenters with fiber, raise circulating butyrate, and T-cells skew regulatory. Those TREGs and their cytokines, IL-10, TGF-beta, quiet the room and indirectly lift OPG. B cells in that climate do more OPG, less trouble. Osteoclast precursors feel less rankle and stall. Mesenchymal stem cells find it easier to choose osteoblast over fat. Meanwhile, macrophages drift toward pro-repair phenotypes that set the stage for vessels and builders. Same marrow, different tone, different build. Now pull the opposite lever. Flatten the microbiome with a broad-spectrum antibiotic at the wrong moment, or let diet starve fermenters. Butyrate drops, barrier integrity slips, endotoxin traffic rises, and innate sensors get tapped too often. Day 17 cells expand, TNF-alpha climbs, rankle flows, osteoclastogenesis gets the green light, and osteoblast precursors lose confidence. You won't feel it that day, but 6 weeks later a stress reaction nags, a DEXA scan drifts, or a callus looks tired. Here's a micro story wired to the board. A collegiate rower stacks a high-impact block after a winter of low fiber and a recent antibiotic for strep. She feels fit. Her marrow does not. Fewer TREGs, more Th17, more Ranka-ul. 2 months in, the navicular aches, films show a slow callus. Nothing exotic happened. The switchboard took a nudge and carried it into structure. Receptors explain the sensitivity. Osteoblasts and osteoclast precursors carry toll-like receptors and nods, so even tiny local motifs can recalibrate them. A safe background of microbial fragments keeps surveillance tuned without spiking Ranka-ul. Flood it, and you get a different marrow, one that prioritizes defense and pays with bone. Hormones don't rewrite the board, they bias it. Estrogen normally reigns in rankle and supports OPG. When estrogen falls, the same microbial inputs land on a hotter audience. More Th17, more TNF-alpha, more osteoclasts. That's why ovariectomized mice lose bone unless you support fermentation. Add Lactobacillus reuteri in those models and resorption eases. Add fiber that boosts butyrate and formation markers rise while osteoclastogenesis drops. The microbe isn't building bone, it's changing how the board hears the baton. Parathyroid hormone therapy makes the point from another angle. Intermittent pulses can be anabolic if the audience is ready. In animal work, butyrate is part of that readiness. Low butyrate, blunted response. Restore it, and osteoprogenitors answer the call. Same drug, same dose, different board tone, different skeletal outcome. There's a Goldilocks problem laced through all this. Too little microbial input and you lose coaching. Immune cells drift, rankle creeps, angiogenesis underperforms. Too much, and innate sensors scream, osteoclast surge, builders stall. Precision isn't optional. It's the difference between a tuned signal and static. Zoom in on traffic. Chemokines like CCL20 respond to microbial and hormonal contexts, recruiting different T-cell subsets to perivascular seats, inches from osteoprogenitors. Those arrivals don't show up empty-handed. Some carry rankle, some carry calm. Angiogenic cues ride the same tide. Vessels that feed formation sprout better in a regulated room. The punchline is hiding in plain sight. That open loop we planted, the lever that flips build to dissolve, isn't a mystical molecule. It's the rankle to OPG balance, written each day by immune cells that have been trained by microbial products. You don't have to guess if it matters, you can watch it. Raise butyrate, see TREGs and IL-10, see OPG rise. Watch osteoclast cultures choke off in dishes and formation markers step up in marrow. Jam the innate receptors, watch rankles spike and then bone markers tilt toward loss. But you can't crash the board with blunt moves and expect grace. Carpet bomb microbes and fracture healing slows. Smother early sterile inflammation with long NSAID IG runs, and you blunt the phase that recruits architects. The right question shifts from more or less microbes to which signals, when, and for whom. Meanwhile, the room hears a choir down the hall. Even if locals whisper in bones microchannels, the gut is loud. Germ-free animals prove the point. Colonize them with fermenters, restore short-chain fatty acids, and the board cools. That's our handoff. If the switchboard sits in marrow, the remote control lives in your colon. Now we trace the wire. The gut-bone axis, remote control. Follow the wire to the colon. Every gram of fiber that escapes your small intestine lands in a fermentation tank staffed by microbes that turn leftovers into instructions. Their clearest message is short-chain fatty acids. Butyrate, propionate, acetate. Small molecules with long reach. They slip into blood, ride to marrow, and set the board's mood before any osteoclast or osteoblast gets called to the floor. Here's where it stops being theory. Raise fermentable fiber, and you raise butyrate producers. In animals, that turns down Th17 heat, lifts TREGs, and dials up OPG. Osteoclastogenesis slows. Mesenchymal stem cells pick osteoblast over fat more often. Trabeculae don't just look prettier on micro-CT, they carry load better. In ovariectomized mice, the lab stand-in for estrogen loss, introducing Lactobacillus reuteri protects bone because it cools the switchboard, not because the bugs move into the femur and pour concrete. The remote control doesn't touch the beam, it talks to the foreman. Humans feel the same physics, just through thicker noise. Diets rich in legumes, whole grains, alliums, and resistant starch tend to raise circulating short-chain fatty acids and lower inflammatory tone, and bone turnover panels lean toward formation. Starve fermenters with ultra-refined menus and fiber in the single digits, and the opposite shows up. The gut lining loosens, microbial bits cross more often, innate sensors ping, and rankle gets airtime it didn't earn. You won't see it at breakfast. You'll see it months later when density lags behind your training. Antibiotics bring a complication with a calendar. When you have a real infection, you take them. But the same drug that clears a lung can flatten fermenters that keep marrow calm, give broad-spectrum agents during growth windows, and peak bone mass stalls in models. Stack courses in older adults, and fracture signals climb in population data. The pattern makes sense. Fewer butyrate producers, more inflammatory drift, a board that leans resorptive. Steer with stewardship, confirm need, narrow spectrum, stop on time, and pair courses with fibers and fermented foods before, during, and after, so the choir has a way back. There's a clinical twist that changed how endocrinologists and microbiologists talk to each other. Intermittent parathyroid hormone can be powerfully anabolic, but in animal work, its success depends on butyrate. With butyrate low, the drug taps a board that won't respond. Restore it, and osteoprogenitors answer. Same dose, different diet, different skeleton. That's not a probiotic pitch, it's a systems reminder. Therapies ride context. A micro story carries the point. A postmenopausal marathoner adds plyometrics, and cleans up calcium and vitamin D. Her DEXA budges, then plateaus. Her meals still run low fiber, low ferment. She adds 30 grams of mixed fibers, consistent fermented foods, and sleeps an extra 45 minutes most nights. 6 months later, butyrate producers rise on a stool profile, CRP dips, and her bone turnover panel leans pro-formation. Training didn't change. The remote turned the volume up on builders. Not all microbes sing the same song. Strain identity matters. Lactobacillus reuteri in estrogen loss models cools resorption. Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG supports barrier and immune tone in ways that can steady the board, but it isn't a skeleton capsule. Blends without strain names are noise. Human trials are mixed because background diet, vitamin D, loading, and medications rewrite the stage. If fiber is low or a proton pump inhibitor is flattening diversity, a probiotic often shrugs. The mouth feeds the line too. Periodontitis keeps immune tone smoldering. Those signals don't stay in your jaw. They land in marrow, nudging rankle. Stabilized gums and systemic markers ease. One body, one board. The same is true for sleep and stress. Poor sleep ramps cytokines, stirs the board hot, and blunts formation even when diet behaves. Fixed sleep and fermentation's whisper carries farther. Spaceflight stress tests the axis. In microgravity, resorption jumps. Astronauts fight back with heavy resistance exercise and vitamin D, but crews that preserve fiber intake and microbial stability may soften the loss by keeping short chain. Fatty acids, steady in the marrow cooler. You can't install gravity in a capsule, but you can support the remote. So what do you pull, practically? Feed fermenters, beans, oats, barley, onions, garlic, leeks, apples, cool potatoes or rice, nuts, seeds, 25 to 35 grams a day. Add 1 to 2 fermented foods you'll actually eat. Keep protein steady so osteoblasts have bricks when the board says build. Use antibiotics only when needed, then rebuild the choir. If you trial a strain, make it a documented one. Give it 8 to 12 weeks and watch markers, not miracles. The handoff is clean. The marrow board runs your skeleton's month-to-month budget. The gut writes much of the script it reads. When that script hums with butyrate, builders hear their cue. When it crackles with inflammatory static, demolishers take the overtime. And if the remote can steer from a distance, we still have one more question to answer. Who's whispering from inside the beams themselves? Inside the fortress. Who's in the bone? Step into the fortress, and the first thing you notice is how hard it is to prove anyone lives here. Bone is low biomass territory. One dusty reagent kit can invent an ecosystem. So the serious teams treated bone like a crime scene. Elective femoral heads went straight into sterile isolators. Surgeons cored past cortex with single-use bits, while air plates and glove swabs shadowed every move. Reagent blanks wrote every extraction. 16S flag candidates, lean signatures from Proteobacteria and Actinobacteria. Shotgun metagenomics helped strip out common contaminants. After all that, a whisper remained in bone more than in the negatives. DNA alone could be fossils from commuters. The question became viability and location. Culture mostly failed, which fit the idea of slow, mineral-adapted tenants. So labs went optical. Fluorescence in situ hybridization with bacterial rRNA probes dotted tiny signals along canal-like paths in a subset of samples, especially near marrow-facing surfaces. Live, dead dyes suggested intact membranes in a few clusters. Confocal stacks traced puncta hugging the lacuno-canalicular network. The same microtunnels osteocytes used to sense strain and talk to builders and demolishers. Skeptics pressed at every seam. Could skin flora hitchhike? Could drills aerosolize? Were we seeing post-mortem colonization in disguise? Protocols tightened further. Some groups used ultra-clean kits borrowed from ancient DNA work, pre-registered contamination controls, and immediate RNase inhibitors on tissue. RNA-scope for bacterial rRNA lit only when that snap-freeze step happened within seconds. Signals dropped to background if tissue warmed. That timing argues activity, not leftover mail. Spatial patterning turned the key. If traces were random traffic, you'd expect a smear. Instead, mapping showed pockets, higher near sinusoids in marrow, around osteocyte lacunae, and lower in outer cortex. In rare longitudinal cases where tiny edge biopsies were ethically repeated months apart, The same sparse taxa appeared in the same niche, while controls stayed dark. Not a city, more like a hamlet tucked near the intercoms. Imaging labs added chemistry to location. Nanosims picked up subtle isotopic hints, local lactate enrichment and mineral to matrix tweaks around probe-positive microzones consistent with low oxygen metabolism. Raman spectra in those zones leaned toward altered collagen cross-linking, not gross decay. Bone wasn't rotting. It was hosting small negotiations at micron scale. Here's why those neighborhoods make sense. The lacuno-canalicular network is protected, perfused by slow fluid and rich in mechanical chatter. Perivascular niches near sinusoids offer nutrients with gentler immune surveillance. If a microbe wanted a safe rental near the wires, those addresses are prime. Thin, disciplined biofilm-like layers measured in microns could eavesdrop on osteocyte talk and leak metabolites. Peptidoglycan fragments, lipoteichoic acid, maybe locally made short-chain fatty acids, into flows immune cells and osteoprogenitors actually feel. The stakes are human. If quiet tenants sit by the switchboard, they don't need mass to matter. A tiny, steady diffusion of motifs can keep pattern recognition receptors tuned so the board doesn't overreact to every bump. After microdamage, that tone might help macrophages pivot from clearing to coaching on schedule, keep angiogenesis crisp, and bias mesenchymal cells toward osteoblasts without flooding rankle ANTA demo. On the flip side, flattening everything with broad antibiotics or reading every whisper as infection risks muting signals that keep remodeling precise. Clinicians needed a line to draw. True osteomyelitis looks like a fire. Pain, heat, systemic signs, labs climbing, imaging with lytic bites or sequestra. The faint, controlled signals in quiet bone weren't that. Teams that sample low biomass tissues now travel with dossiers, air and glove swabs, reagent blanks, multiple primer sets, culture plus molecular tools, and an infection team trained to read whispers without panic. When faint reads emerge in asymptomatic bone, restraint replaces reflex. A micro story keeps it grounded. A woman in her late 70s needed hardware removal after a well-healed ankle fracture. With consent, the team took a sliver from the callus edge. RNA scope only signaled when tissue hit inhibitors immediately. The same lean actinobacteria signature reappeared at the same niche in a planned relook months apart. Controls were clean. Her healing was smooth, films boring. It wasn't proof of help, but it pushed the question from, are they there? To, what do they do when we're not looking? Not every study finds the whisper. Geography, age, diet, medications, loading history, and protocol rigor probably shape who can live in the fortress and when. Think guild, not roster. The responsible position today: evidence supports microbial signatures in healthy bone and marrow. In some people under strict controls, with orthogonal signs and select micro-niches consistent with low activity, function remains a testable, open question. The payoff is a mindset shift, already changing checklists. Keep pathogens out, surgical technique, air discipline, targeted prophylaxis, while avoiding collateral that flattens helpful cues in clean bone. Design implant surfaces that steer macrophages and osteoblasts toward repair and give pathogens no perch. And when a whisper shows up in a quiet patient, measure twice before you reach for the hose. Because the fortress isn't empty. It's guarded space with a few quiet squatters near the intercoms. Their voices are small, but the intercom feeds the floor. Next, we stress that system and watch how those cues play when a bone breaks and the site turns into a construction zone. Break, bleed, build, fracture healing as a microbial symphony. Snap a tibia and the fortress flips into choreography. First, a contained storm. Blood floods the gap, a clot forms, and sterile inflammation lights the room. Neutrophils arrive to clear debris. Macrophages follow, sensing danger through pattern recognition receptors and deciding whether to attack or assist. That opening heat isn't a mistake. It's the cue that summons architects. Kill it too early and the rest of the cast misses their entrance. Let it rage too long and you scorch the stage you're trying to rebuild. Meanwhile, the remote control is already playing. Short-chain fatty acids drifting in from the gut, especially butyrate, reach marrow and bias macrophages toward pro-repair phenotypes. They still clean, but they also release IL-10 and TGF-beta, the quiet that lets endothelial cells sprout vessels into the hematoma. Those new capillaries are lifelines. Builders need oxygen, nutrients, and a way to carry out waste. When microbial tone runs calm, angiogenesis threads clean. When it runs hot, the lanes clog. Here's the stakes check. Delayed unions and non-unions can steal months or never resolve without a second surgery. That's time off work, lost independence, and pain that rewrites a life. If the first 48 hours set the tempo, diet in the weeks before a fall in antibiotic choices, in the days after, can tip a case from smooth bridging to a stubborn gap. Action unfolds in phases. As vessels cross the fracture, mesenchymal stem cells swarm from periosteum and marrow, guided by gradients that early responders laid down. The callus forms first as cartilage, a soft brace that stabilizes the break, then mineralizes into woven bone. Osteoclasts still chew at the edges, shaping the new structure and clearing mislaid scaffolding. The switchboard governs that balance. Enough rankle to remodel, enough OPG to keep demolishers from eating tomorrow's bridge. Microbial products thread every decision. Butyrate raises tregs that keep T817 and TNF-alpha from flooding the room. Propionate reigns in excessive neutrophil swarms that shred early matrices. Tiny, safe levels of microbial fragments tuned by barrier integrity tickle receptors on osteoblasts and endothelial cells, making them more responsive to growth factors and mechanical cues. It's not that bugs nip bone, their signals keep the crew on schedule. A micro story shows the cost of static. 2 patients, similar midshaft tibia fractures, same fixation. One had a broad-spectrum antibiotic course the week before his crash and eats 10 grams of fiber on a good day. The other landed in the operating room with steady fermented foods and 30-plus grams of mixed fibers most days. At 6 weeks, both show callus. At 12, the first looks moth-eaten. Pain lingers, labs whisper smolder, and a CT hints non-union. The second's bridge is solid. He's at physical therapy arguing for sprints. Same hardware, different board. Surgeons live on a tightrope. Infection versus assistance. Open fractures, contaminated wounds, or rising fevers demand antibiotics. Full stop. But in clean, closed fractures, prophylaxis is brief by design. Extending just in case can flatten fermenters and mute the postbiotic cues that nudge macrophages toward repair right when they need the nudge. That's not ideology. It's timing grounded in mechanism. NSAIDs add a second tightrope. Pain needs control, but long, high-dose courses can blunt the sterile inflammatory phase that recruits the cast. The move is minimal effective dose in the early window, then off, so the pivot to calm can happen and the remote can be heard. Loading is the metronome bones craved. As soon as the team clears it, gentle, weight-bearing, and progressive forces tell osteocytes to call builders. Without load, even a perfect switchboard struggles to justify formation. With load and a fed choir, osteoprogenitors hear both the push and the permission. You can tune the room before you ever break. 4 weeks leading into elective osteotomy or joint fusion. Aim for 25 to 35 grams of fermentable fiber, 1 to 2 fermented foods most. These, sufficient protein at each meal, and vitamin D checked and corrected. The goal isn't a cleanse, it's a choir that can supply butyrate when the curtain rises. Post-op resume that routine early, walk as cleared, and sleep like it matters. Because it does. Poor sleep heats cytokines and blunts formation. Good sleep lets the signal carry. A teenage striker with a Jones fracture gets a screw, and a lecture that includes 1 extra line. Keep antibiotics tight, skip long NSAID stretches after day 3 unless pain demands, hit fibers and fermented foods daily. 6 weeks later, callus looks thick. At 10, she's back on the field. Was it luck? It was biology lined up to make luck likely. The hardest calls live in the gray. A faint microbial read in a quiet callus without fever, swelling, or lytic changes isn't osteomyelitis. Treat the patient, not a whisper. Serial labs, matched imaging, and, if sampling is required, contamination-proof protocols keep you from chasing ghosts. When a true pathogen grabs hardware, you bring steel and drugs. When the room is simply off-key, you restore the score the body expects. Break, bleed, build. It sounds simple until you watch it fail. Microbial tone doesn't replace steel or skill. It decides whether the crew hears the downbeat, threads vessels on time, and hands osteoblasts a stage that can hold weight. When the switchboard runs cool and the choir hums, the fracture doesn't just close, it learns, and the fortress returns stronger where it cracked. Hormones, growth, and the microbial metronome. If fracture healing is choreography, hormones are the tempo, markings the body can't ignore. Puberty accelerates, pregnancy modulates, menopause drops the beat, and the colony either softens or sharpens each change. The same hormone pulse can land as protection or as porosity, depending on whether butyrate is humming and the marrow switchboard runs cool or hot. Start with estrogen, because its fingerprint on bone is clear. In steady states, estrogen reigns in rankle and supports OPG, keeping osteoclasts from running wild. When estrogen falls, immune tone rises. More Th17, more TNF-alpha, and resorption outpaces formation. That's the well-known arc of postmenopausal bone loss. Here's where microbes step in. Diets that maintain fermenters and short-chain fatty acids blunt that immune heat. In animal models, dysbiosis mimics estrogen loss. Barrier slackens, endotoxin drifts, rankle climbs, restore fiber, elevate butyrate producers, and the board cools, even though estrogen hasn't budged. The metronome changes how the same hormone sounds. Puberty flips the script. Growth hormone and IGF-1 surge, osteoblasts flood the stage, collagen scaffold stack, and mineral follows. Microbial metabolites nudge that axis. Butyrate and propionate influence enter endocrine signaling and hepatic IGF-1, tuning how growth signals reach bone. Germ-free animals often show altered IGF-1 and inconsistent peak bone mass. Colonization that restores fermentation normalizes the climb. Translation for families. A teen who loads their frame and feeds fermenters probably sets a higher ceiling for life. Pregnancy writes a different score. The body delivers calcium to a fetus without erasing the mother's frame. Estrogen climbs, intestinal absorption rises, and immunity reshapes across barriers. Commensal communities that keep barriers tight and supply short-chain fatty acids help sustain a protective tone, so resorption doesn't overrun formation while mineral economics reroute. Postpartum, lactation can tilt toward resorption. Again, diet and microbial stability soften the dip and speed the rebound. Parathyroid hormone therapy makes the feedback visible. Intermittent pulses are famously anabolic when the context cooperates. In animals, that cooperation depends on butyrate. When butyrate is low, parathyroid hormone's effect dulls. When butyrate is restored through fiber or a tolerated tributylin adjunct, osteoprogenitors respond and formation markers rise. Same drug, different choir, different build. That's not a loophole, it's a lever. Patients stalling on therapy deserve a look at their fermentation capacity, not just their dosage. Bidirectionality runs through all of it. Hormones shape microbes. Estrogen tweaks bile acids and mucosal immunity, changing who blooms in the gut. Growth hormone shifts nutrient flux, which shifts fermentation substrates. Pregnancy rewires immune policing across the intestine. So when we say microbes modulate hormones' effects on bone, we also admit hormones remodel the choir that makes the modulators. That's why timing matters. The strain that plays nice in midlife can feel irrelevant or noisy during transitions if sleep, diet, and load don't support the loop. Zoom into the room where choices get made. Chemokines like CCL20 rise and fall with hormonal and microbial cues, recruiting T-cell subsets to perivascular seats inches from osteoprogenitors. Estrogen tends to thin the pro-resorptive crowd. Dysbiosis invites them back. Short-chain fatty acids promote tregs that protect OPG, and estrogen amplifies that calm. Remove either partner, the calm fractures. Pair them, the board holds formation. A micro-story anchors it. Two perimenopausal friends live together. Same sets, same calcium and vitamin D. One eats 30 grams of mixed fibers, something fermented most days, and guards 7 to 8 hours of sleep. The other grazes on low-fiber convenience food and rotates antibiotics for sinus flares. 12 months later, their DEXA prints don't rhyme. Training didn't pick favorites. The metronome did. One board ran cool enough for estrogen's last protective years to land. The other ran hot and wrote rankle. Don't mistake Symph's for the whole orchestra. Microbial vitamin K2 supports osteocalcin carboxylation and mineral binding. Bile acid derivatives, shaped by gut communities, signal through receptors found on bone lineage and immune neighbors. Urolithins and polyphenol metabolites can influence mitochondrial health in osteoblasts. None of these replace load, protein, calcium, or vitamin D. They make those inputs count by quieting static and smoothing traffic. What do you do with this on a Tuesday? Match life's hormonal beats with support the board can hear. In puberty, load the frame, jumps, sprints, sports, and feed fermenters. In pregnancy, prioritize protein, calcium, vitamin D, and steady fibers you tolerate. Lean on simple ferments to stabilize tone if your clinician agrees. Postpartum and during lactation, protect sleep when you can, maintain fibers, and reintroduce impact gradually when cleared. In perimenopause, double down on mixed fibers, daily fermented foods, progressive resistance, and impact tailored to joints. Review unnecessary antibiotics and proton pump inhibitors that flatten diversity. On parathyroid hormone therapy, pair pulses with diet that reliably makes butyrate, and discuss adjuncts if tolerated. Microbes won't override hormones. They adjust how loudly hormones play through the marrow, keep the metronome steady, and the same endocrine shifts land as music the skeleton can use. Let it drift, and those shifts become noise the board answers with resorption. The tempo changes are coming either way. The tone is up to the choir. Aging bones, aging bugs. Time changes the frame, and it changes the choir. By the 6th and 7th decades, two trends creep in together. Bones build more slowly, while the gut's fermenters hum more quietly. Less fiber usually makes it to the colon. Daily movement shrinks. Medications stack up, sleep frays, and the background hiss of inflammation, what researchers call inflammaging, rises. The marrow switchboard hears it all as more rankle, less OPG. The demolition crew doesn't sprint, it just never clocks out. Here's the stakes check without sugarcoating. Hip fractures often end independence. Vertebral compression fractures shorten breath and shrink lives. A small slip with a slow heal can reroute the next year. If microbial tone nudged the board in youth, that nudge matters more when hormones ebb and reserves thin. Aging bones live on margins, and aging bugs help set those margins. Start where leverage is biggest, the colon. Older adults often eat less total food and much less fermentable fiber. Diversity drops. Butyrate producers lose their foothold. With butyrate down, tregs fade, the H17 tone rises, and marrow runs hot. Osteoclasts find it easier to mature. Osteoblast precursors stall more often. Angiogenesis that feeds formation underperforms. None of this announces itself on Tuesday. It shows up across months. DEXA, drifting faster than expected. A stress reaction that refuses to settle. A callus that looks thin at 12 weeks. Inside marrow, immunosenescence tilts the room. Naive T cells decline, memory and senescent phenotypes accumulate, and cytokines drift toward IL-6 and TNF-alpha. B cells that used to be quiet OPG suppliers get distracted. The rankulodiol creeps, add winter vitamin D lows, poor sleep, or a long NSAID run, and the dial clicks again. Now the good news, the choir is trainable at every age. Trials in older adults show that increasing fermented foods or adding diverse fibers can lower inflammatory markers and modestly raise circulating short-chain fatty acids. Early pilots link those shifts to bone turnover panels, leaning toward formation. Pair that with resistance training and joint-friendly impact, and osteocytes get the mechanical reason they need to call builders. The point isn't miracles, it's stacking small, reliable edges, a micro-story you can feel. Two neighbors in their 70s walk the same block. One grazes on toast, tea, and convenience foods, takes a long-standing proton pump inhibitor, and grabs an antibiotic each time a cough lingers. The other builds simple bowls, beans, barley, greens, adds yogurt or kefir, and works with a clinician to trim the proton pump inhibitor while managing reflux. 6 months later, labs split. Higher, IL-6 and low butyrate producers versus a modest short-chain fatty acid bump and softer inflammatory tone. A winter slip leaves one in a cast with a slow callus and the other with a bruise and a story. Medications matter. Proton pump inhibitors can reshape microbial communities and reduce mineral absorption. Repeated antibiotics carve ruts in diversity. Steroids push resorption hard. SSRIs correlate with fracture risk in some datasets, possibly through falls, appetite, or microbiome shifts. None of these are automatic villains. They're tools with bone side effects. The fix isn't to ditch care, it's to coordinate. Confirm bacterial causes, choose narrow spectrums, capturations, and support the choir before, during, and after. Sarcopenia multiplies the problem. Lose muscle, lose tug on bone, loading signals fade, protein often dips, and collagen assembly stalls. Spread protein through the day, 20 to 30 grams per meal, so osteoblasts have raw material when the board gives them room. Collagen supplements aren't mandatory, but if they help hit targets comfortably, they're useful. Vitamin C shows up in the background, quietly supporting cross-linking. Sleep becomes a hidden lever. Fragmented nights raise cytokines, tilt the board hot, and blunt formation. Simple routines, consistent bedtimes, morning light, caffeine earlier, screens away from pillows, sound like lifestyle fluff until you watch bone markers and recovery speed change. When sleep steadies, microbial whispers carry farther. Space research offers a mirror elders can use. Remove load, watch resorption jump. Flatten diets, stress the gut, and short-chain fatty acids fall. Astronaut countermeasures: heavy resistance, vitamin D, careful fiber despite constraints. Map cleanly to bed rest periods after surgeries or illness. If you know downtime is coming, preload the choir. Build fiber and fermented foods now, keep protein high, and walk as cleared the moment you can. Complications are real. Older guts can be touchy. Add fiber slowly, vary sources, and stop at comfort, not dogma. Fermented food should be simple, labeled, and tolerated. Probiotics remain strain-specific. Quality control matters, and many elders do better dialing in food first. If a trial makes sense, pick documented strains and set an 8 to 12-week window with a stock rule. Practical tune-up, 4 steps. 1. Aim for 25 to 35 grams of mixed fermentable fiber most days. Beans, lentils, oats, barley, onions, leeks, apples, cooled starches, nuts, seeds. 2. 1 to 2 fermented foods you actually like. 3. Protein at each meal and vitamin D checked and corrected. 4. Resistance training 2 to 3 days weekly with safe impact as joints allow, plus balance work to avoid the fall in the first place. A last micro story. An 80-year-old schedules a knee replacement. 4 weeks out, his team trims unnecessary meds, tightens prophylaxis to standard, and sets a fiber and fermented food target with protein at each meal. He walks early, avoids long NSAID runs, and gets back to the routine within days. 3 months later, films are boring in the best way. It wasn't luck, it was a cool switchboard and a fed choir meeting good surgery halfway. Aging isn't a cliff, it's a negotiation. Keep the choir humming and the margins shift in your favor. When collaboration fails, disease and the colony. Partnerships collapse in 2 ways. A pathogen storms the fortress, or the quiet cues drift off-key without an invader. Both end with weaker bone, but the fixes are opposites. Start with the fire. Osteomyelitis is not subtle. A pathogen, often Staphylococcus aureus, lands on compromised bone or hardware, builds a biofilm, and digs in. Pain sharpens, warmth rises, lab spike, and imaging shows lytic bites, sequestra, or periosteal reactions. The board is hijacked. Inflammatory noise floods rankle. Osteoclasts chew through structure, and osteoblasts stall. You fight with debridement, irrigation, targeted antibiotics, sometimes staged reconstruction. The colony's helpful whispers don't negotiate with a blaze. Steel, scalpels, and drugs do. Now the thermostat problem. Dysbiosis without infection looks boring until it isn't. Fewer fermenters, lower short-chain fatty acids, leakier barriers, and a marrow switchboard that hears more Th17 and TNF-alpha than IL-10. Rankin climbs, OPG retreats. Resorption takes cheap wins day after day. You feel it as stalled gains, slow recovery, or a fracture risk curve bending the wrong way. There's no single villain microbe here. It's the pattern, the absence of steady butyrate, the presence of smolder that pulls the board toward demolition. Autoimmune disease shows how remote noise breaks local structure. In rheumatoid arthritis, T-cell and cytokine storms dissolve joint margins, but the spillover reaches bone far from synovium. Oral and gut dysbiosis amplify Th17 tone. Rankin spreads systemically. Periodontitis adds fuel. Chronic gum inflammation sends signals that tilt marrow toward resorption. Stabilized gums and gut and systemic markers ease. Proof that one body shares one switchboard. Therapies can push the wrong way. Long steroid runs raise resorption. Repeated broad-spectrum antibiotics flatten fermenters. Proton pump inhibitors reshape communities and dim mineral absorption. Some psych meds nudge appetite, weight, and microbiota. None of these are cartoon villains. They're life-saving in context. The lever is planning. Confirm bacterial causes. Keep spectrums narrow and durations right-sized. Feed fermenters around unavoidable courses. And monitor bone markers when treatment plans predict hot marrow. A micro story from the gray zone. A 56-year-old with recurrent sinus infections, long proton pump inhibitor use, and a winter of antibiotics shows vertebral compression fractures out of proportion to age. No fevers, no lytic lesions, no abscess. Labs whisper inflammation, vitamin D runs low. His team doesn't chase ghosts with months of antibiotics. They fix the obvious. Taper proton pump inhibitor under supervision. Confirm sinus pathogens before scripts. Rebuild diet around fermentable fibers and fermented foods. Correct vitamin D. Add resistance training. 6 months later, bone turnover leans toward formation, symptoms ease, and no infections were missed. The colony didn't fix vertebrae. It stopped pulling the rug. Implants raised the stakes. True paraprosthetic joint infection is a 5-alarm emergency. Pain, swelling, sinus tracts, abnormal inflammatory labs, positive cultures that match a story, and films that betray loosening with heat. You debride and retain if criteria fit or stage an exchange. You target pathogens. But faint sequencing reads in an asymptomatic patient with normal labs and tight films aren't infection. Low biomass tools detect whispers. Interpretation needs context, or you carpet bomb a gut that your hardware needs on its side. Stewardship here is not softness, it is osseointegration strategy. Dental infections draw the same line. A jaw that throbs, swells, and shows cortical breach on imaging gets drainage, debridement, and targeted coverage. A mouth with chronic gingival bleeding, no abscess, and elevated inflammatory tone is a thermostat. You clean, you stabilize, and you feed a calmer immune board. Mixing those categories hurts people. Athletes and elders share a trap, mistaking noise for fire. A tibial stress reaction with no systemic signs doesn't want weeks of antibiotics, just in case. It wants load management, sleep, fiber-fed fermentation, vitamin D sufficiency, and, when pain allows, progressive forces that remind osteocytes why to build. A low-energy hip fracture with clean cultures and a quiet wound needs short, standard prophylaxis and a choir that can deliver postbiotics, not a month-long tail that mutes them. Contamination is still the dragon in low biomass science. One dirty kit can fake an ecosystem. One glove touch can invent an infection. That's why serious teams bring dossiers. Match negatives, multiple primer sets, culture plus molecular assays, orthogonal imaging when it's ethical, and clinicians trained to weigh whispers against patients. If a result doesn't survive that gauntlet, it doesn't get to steer care. Here's the rule you can take home. Flames get hoses, thermostats get tuning. Infection demands cutting, draining, and targeted drugs. Dysbiosis demands diet patterns that raise butyrate, antibiotic restraint, gum care, sleep that cools cytokines, and loading that gives osteoblasts purpose. Most skeleton failures aren't dramatic betrayals. They're months of static that push the board toward resorption without anyone noticing. The colony is a partner, not a panacea. When collaboration fails, name the failure honestly. Then pick the right tool. Scalpel or spoon, spectrum or salad, debridement or daily fiber. That's how you protect steel, save months, and keep builders on the clock. Levers we can pull. Diet, probiotics, prebiotics, postbiotics. We've sat at the switchboard long enough. Let's pull levers you can reach. Start with the choir's fuel, fermentable fiber. Aim for 25 to 35 grams a day from foods that microbes actually like. Beans and lentils, oats and barley, onions, leeks and garlic, apples and berries, nuts and seeds, and resistant starch from cool potatoes or rice. Mixed sources matter because different microbes specialize. Give the guild a buffet, not a single dish. When fermentation hums, butyrate and propionate rise, The marrow cools, rankle eases, and builders get time on the clock. Layer in fermented foods, not as magic, but as steady nudges. Yogurt or kefir with live cultures, tempeh, miso, sauerkraut, kimchi, simple brine vegetables. 1 to 2 small servings most days deliver organisms and metabolites while promoting diversity. Choose labels that name cultures and skip post-pasteurization products. If dairy is out, stick with vegetable ferments and tempeh. This is background music for the board, not a solo. Prebiotics are named fibers. Microbes turn into postbiotics. You can buy inulin, fructooligosaccharides, galacto-oligosaccharides, partially hydrolyzed guar gum, and resistant starch, but most people can meet needs with food. If you use supplements, start low, half a teaspoon, to avoid gas that makes you quit. Increase slowly over 1 to 2 weeks. The goal is a sustainable hum, not a weekend sprint. Protein is the builder's bricks. Bone is mineral on collagen, so hit 20 to 30 grams of protein at each meal. Spread it out so osteoblasts never wait on amino acids when the board says build. Poultry, fish, eggs, legumes, soy, dairy if tolerated. Pick what fits your life. Vitamin C quietly supports collagen cross-linking. Fruits and vegetables cover it without drama. Probiotics are where details save time and money. Strain identity, dose, and duration matter. Lactobacillus reuteri strains have animal data in estrogen loss models that cool resorption. Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG supports barrier and immune tone that can steady the board. Multi-strain blends without strain names are slogans. If you trial a probiotic, pick a documented strain with viable counts through shelf life, run it 8 to 12 weeks, and monitor sleep, GI comfort, and with your clinician, simple labs. If nothing moves, stop. Food first still wins. Postbiotics, the metabolites themselves, are clean in theory. Butyrate is the headliner because it consistently supports TREGs, raises IL-10 and TGF-beta, and leans OPG up. Straight sodium butyrate tastes rough and can irritate. Tributyrin delivers butyrate more gently. If you consider it with your clinician, start low. Watch GI tolerance and frame it as an adjunct to diet, not a replacement. Let your colon make most of your butyrate the old-fashioned way. Antibiotic stewardship is bone stewardship. Use antibiotics when infections are real, choose the narrowest spectrum that covers the bug, and stop on time. Avoid casual scripts for viral colds or just in case. Before a non-negotiable course, raise fibers and fermented foods. During, keep them steady. If you add a probiotic, separate it from antibiotic doses by a few hours and keep expectations realistic. The goal is resilience, not immunity to collateral damage. NSAIDs need timing discipline. Early sterile inflammation after injury is a cue, not a mistake. Use the smallest effective dose for the shortest window your surgeon recommends. Then step off so macrophages can pivot and postbiotics can be heard. For training aches, don't preload sessions with anti-inflammatories. You'll blunt the adaptive signals bones need to justify building. Sleep turns the volume knob on the whole board. Poor sleep heats cytokines and dampens formation. Basic moves, regular bed and wake times, morning light, caffeine earlier, dimmer evenings are boring until you watch recovery speed and bone turnover markers shift. When nights settle, microbial whispers travel farther. Training pairs with food. Impact and resistance are the metronome. The choir is the permission. Stack your heaviest loading days with evening meals that deliver mixed fermentable fibers and protein. So marrow here's build, and osteoblasts have bricks. Keep vitamin D in range with your clinician. Calcium shows up in food or supplements when diet falls short. Prehab is leverage you control. 4 weeks before elective orthopedic work, hit a weekday fiber target you can sustain, add a daily fermented food, check and correct vitamin D, and anchor protein at each meal. Ask your team about standard, short, perioperative prophylaxis and when you can restart your gut routine. Post-op, walk as cleared, avoid long NSAID ID runs, and keep the choir humming. You are not sterilizing the fortress. You're protecting the cues. Quality control matters. Probiotic labels should list strain names and counts at expiry. Postbiotics should have third-party testing and straightforward ingredients. Fermented food should say, contains live active cultures. Skip miracle claims. The Switchboard responds to patterns, not marketing. Personalized with light touch. Track sleep, steps, pain, and training. If your clinician agrees, watch vitamin D and simple bone turnover markers when you make changes. You're looking for direction, not perfection. Feed fermenters, protect the choir when medicine must get loud, load the frame, and let the board play the song bones evolve to hear. Steel, cement, and cells. Implants meet the microbiome. When metal meets marrow, biology decides if the handshake sticks. Osseointegration isn't just threads and torque. It's a conversation between surfaces, immune cells, and the microbial tone that sets the rankle to OPG dial. If the room runs hot, more Th17, more TNF-alpha, more rankle, osteoclasts nibble at the interface and radiolucent lines creep in. If the board is calm and builders have permission, trabeculae grow into texture and the implant stops feeling foreign. Surface is where the story starts. Modern titanium arrives blasted or etched to micro and nano topographies that osteoblasts can grip. Add thin calcium phosphate or bioactive ceramic layers, and you nudge mesenchymal cells to choose bone over fibrous tissue. Clever coatings go further. They bias macrophages toward pro-repair phenotypes that secrete IL-10 and TGF-beta, quiet rankle, and make room for angiogenesis. The art is dual-use, unfriendly to pathogens, friendly to healing. Antimicrobial strategies walk a tightrope. Silver and iodine deter adhesion. Antibiotic-loaded cement protects high-risk joints, but scorched earth leaching can harm host cells or drive resistance. Newer moves tether agents to surfaces so they don't wash into the gut, or use Witteronic brushes that resist any biofilm without dripping drugs. Some teams test antimicrobial peptides that punch holes in pathogen membranes while sparing host cells. The goal isn't sterile forever. It's no foothold until osteoblasts lock in. The operating room sets the tone. Prophylaxis works because it's precise. Dose on time before incision. Sometimes a brief tail, then stop. Extending courses just in case flattens fermenters at the worst moment, muting short-chain fatty acids that help macrophages pivot to repair. Stewardship becomes implant strategy. Narrow spectrum, right timing, early off. Meanwhile, nutrition and sleep sound boring until you watch early films. Patients who arrive with a fed choir, 25 to 35 grams of mixed fibers most days, 1 to 2 fermented foods, vitamin D in range, steady protein, often knit cleaner. Here's a micro story to make it real. 2 total knees, same surgeon, same alloy, similar alignment. Patient 1 gets guideline prophylaxis, walks day 1, resumes fiber and ferments day 2, keeps NSAID short, and sleeps. Patient 2 leaves with an extra safe antibiotic week, low appetite, and constipation. 6 weeks, both look fine. 12 weeks, patient 1's interface tightens, patient 2's cup shows faint halos without symptoms, no infection. Different boards. Cold marrow let builders work, hot marrow stalled. Scaffolds raise the stakes. Spine cages and segmental defect matrices aren't inert. They bring structure plus cues. Calcium phosphate, collagen, bioglass that invite blood and osteoprogenitors. Some centers wet synthetic grafts with marrow aspirate concentrate, delivering mesenchymal cells and growth factors. Context still rules. If the board runs calm and butyrate is flowing, macrophages clear and coach. Endothelial cells thread vessels through the lattice, osteoblasts lay woven bone. Teams are piloting local postbiotics, coating scaffolds with tethered butyrate analogs at doses that bias macrophages on site without flooding the body. Biofilm is the nightmare that changes plans. Once a pathogen like Staphylococcus aureus builds a shield on hardware, antibiotics struggle to penetrate. Then you're choosing debridement and retain if criteria fit or staging an exchange. That's why skin prep, air discipline, gentle handling, and those on-time pre-incision doses never go out of style. But there's a second hazard. Mistaking a faint molecular read for infection in an asymptomatic joint with normal labs and tight films. Low biomass tools detect whispers. Interpretation needs context, or you'll carpet bomb the gut that your interface needs to stay calm. Cement is a lever with a tail. Antibiotic-loaded bone cement can be life-saving in revision or high-risk primary cases. But elution is spiky, and spectrum matters. Matching agent to likely pathogens. keeping doses therapeutic without bathing tissue in collateral, and avoiding cement when press-fit biology will likely win are choices that ripple straight to marrow tone. The point isn't to fear cement, it's to treat it as one voice and a choir you want in tune. Prehab is becoming protocol. Some centers now screen for risks that heat the board. Recent antibiotics, proton pump inhibitor use, low-fiber diets, low vitamin D, and offer a 4-week tune-up. Fiber target, daily fermented food, protein distribution, alcohol trimmed, sleep defended. They plan prophylaxis tightly, hold long NSAID runs after the early window, and resume gut routines within days. None of this replaces sterile field discipline. It complements it by protecting the postbiotic signals that steer integration. A final micro story at the edge. A climber needs an ankle fusion. Her team chooses a roughened, bioactive coated plate, packs a calcium phosphate scaffold with her marrow aspirate, gives standard prophylaxis, and stops. She hits her prehab, fiber and ferments most days, vitamin D solid, protein steady, NSAIDs short, sleep guarded. 6 weeks, early trabeculae lace the gap. 12 weeks, the line fades. No magic capsule, just steel speaking the right language to a board ready to listen. Implants don't conquer biology. They collaborate with it. Keep pathogens out, keep signals in, and the interface writes itself. Miss either side, and you fight for purchase. The microbiome isn't the surgeon, but it is the room's acoustics. Tune it, and metal feels like bone. Deep time, fossil clues, and ancient partnerships. To see how old this partnership might be, leave the operating room and walk into stone. Fossil bones carry 2 overlapping histories: the animal's life and everything that touched bone after death. If microbes and skeletons have shared space for ages, the rock should remember with scars you can still read. Start with the tunnels. Paleontologists have logged microscopic borings lacing dinosaur and other vertebrate bones, branching, filamentous tracks that match patterns known from microbial activity. They're not random cracks. They curve along old growth lines, weave through mineral and collagen, and repeat across species and continents. That persistence hints at a standing invitation. Bone, even when fossilizing, is a niche microbes understand. Here's the stakes check. If bone looked like a good address to microbes tens of millions of years ago, host defenses and remodeling didn't evolve in a vacuum. Vertebrates learned to build, repair, and defend with microbial pressure at the door, and sometimes inside the foyer. That makes today's low biomass whispers less like a modern glitch and more like a long negotiation resurfacing in better labs. But there's a trap called diagenesis, the chemical rewriting that happens after death. Water percolates, minerals swap, and newcomers move in. So teams treat fossils like forensics. They thin section bones and ask, do tunnels cross healed growth rings laid down during life, or do they track along later mineral seams? Do they show mineralized halos consistent with metabolism on site, or are they just voids? When patterns respect the bone's original histology and carry chemical gradients that fit in situ activity, the ante-mortem case gets stronger. Sometimes, the rock preserves more than holes. Extraordinary fossils show skin shadows, outlines where bacterial colonies mineralized along decaying tissues. Those lithified mats mirror original contours with eerie precision. They don't prove bone residency in life, but they prove how fast microbes claim tissue, organize, and leave durable marks. If they can do that within hours to days after death, it's plausible that during life, when microdamage, low oxygen, and mineral niches appear, quiet tenants could sample the same terrain under an immune truce. Comparative pathology adds human texture. Ancient skeletons carry healed lesions and reactive bone that read like long-running inflammatory episodes. Periosteal new bone laid in onion skin layers, remodeled lytic zones that later filled. Signatures that today we'd link to cycles of immune heat, infection control, and repair. The story isn't microbiome in a headline. It's immune systems and bone dancing to microbial rhythms before there were headlines. Teeth widen the lens. Mineralized dental plaque from ancient humans preserves oral microbiomes that shifted with agriculture and industrial diets. As communities lost diversity and tilted toward inflammatory profiles, dental and skeletal disease footprints changed. One body, one board in the distant past too. The mouse signals didn't stop at gums. They likely landed in marrow, nudging resorption and repair even when no one could name rankle or OPG. Sharks offer a parallel with better chemistry. Fossilized tooth decay has been mapped with modern tools to show in situ microbial metabolism, captured mid-meal. Teeth aren't bones, but they share mineral logic. Mineral invites microbes that tolerate low oxygen and live slow. Hosts that overreacted probably paid with cracks that didn't heal. Hosts that underreacted paid with infections. Selection favored a balance. Barriers, pattern recognition, and remodeling, tuned to whispers. The evolutionary logic is simple. Bone is mineral-rich, vascularized, and laced with microtunnels. Microbes that can survive low oxygen and feast slowly will show up. Hosts that turned constant skirmish into calibrated dialogue kept moving. Pattern recognition receptors tuned to safe background motifs. Immune cells stationed near osteoprogenitors. Osteocytes wiring mechanical signals into immune tone. Those aren't modern flourishes. They read like solutions refined against a pressure that never left. Of course, fossils won't hand us genomes from deep time. Ancient DNA rarely survives beyond thousands of years, and contamination stalks every lab. That's why the strongest arguments lean on structure and geochemistry, not sequences. Repeated tunnel morphologies, mineral halos, and textures that duplicate known microbial handiwork across eras tell a consistent story. Microbes' new bones. A field microstory closes the loop. A researcher splits a late Cretaceous limb bone and lifts a thin section to the scope. Hair-thin tunnels fan around an old growth line. Halos of different minerals shimmer along the tracks. Back in her notes, she sketches the pattern next to a modern image of the licheno-canalicular network and writes one line. They've been here a while. When you walk back into surgery with that line in your head, the present feels less speculative. The low biomass signals in healthy bone aren't a fad. They're a modern glimpse of an ancient arrangement. Our job isn't to romanticize squatters, it's to respect the rules evolution left. Keep invaders out, keep whispers in, and let immune-literate scaffolds use quiet microbial coaching to heal on time. Hype, myths, and hard lines. Time to clear the fog. First hard line. There is no credible evidence that 10% of your bone mass is living microbes. The 10% idea is about leverage, not biomass. A tiny microbial footprint and distant postbiotics can steer the Rankle to OPG dial. Bones aren't teeming sponges. They're low biomass habitats with signals that matter. Second line, DNA isn't life. Finding bacterial DNA, or even ribosomal RNA, in bone or marrow suggests presence, maybe activity, but it doesn't mean a thriving colony you can culture. Low biomass work is fragile. One contaminated kit can fabricate a community. That's why serious studies show their negatives, run multiple primer sets, use orthogonal imaging, and, when possible, lock RNA down within seconds. If a paper waves off controls, it's a placeholder, not a pillar. Myth swipe number 1. A probiotic cures osteoporosis. No. Animal data show select strains can tilt immune tone and reduce resorption under defined conditions, especially with estrogen loss. Human trials are mixed, small, and strain-specific. If a label won't list strain names and viable counts at expiry, it's selling vibes. Diet-driven short-chain fatty acids have broader, sturdier support than any capsule. Myth swipe number 2. Antibiotics always wreck bones. Infections need antibiotics. The risk sits in casual, repeated courses that flatten fermenters during growth, aging, or healing windows. Stewardship is context. Confirm the bug, choose narrow spectrum, stop on time, and rebuild the choir with fibers and fermented foods around non-negotiable courses. That's bone thinking, not fear. Myth swipe number 3. Locals living in bone prove a universal bone microbiome. Current evidence supports sparse, spatially patterned signals in some people under strict protocols, with imaging and chemistry that argue low activity near osteocyte networks and sinusoids. That's a guild, not a global roster. Function remains a testable question, not a settled fact. Here's a hype magnet to avoid. Biological transmutation. Claims that microbes alchemize elements inside us to build mineral. There's no credible evidence in human physiology. Bone mineral tracks diet, hormones, drugs, disease, and remodeling. not atomic magic. Keep your eyes on levers we can measure. Rankle, OPG, short-chain fatty acids, cytokines, mechanosensing. Media overshoots in both directions. Clickbait wants, bones are crawling with bugs, and eat this to fix your skeleton by Friday. Dry papers bury stakes under caveats. We live in the middle. Bones aren't empty cathedrals. They're guarded work sites where quiet microbial cues help or hinder. Infection is still the fire you put out. Dysbiosis is the thermostat you tune. Use timing as your lie detector. Early fracture repair needs sterile inflammation before it needs calm. Menopause rewires immunity. The same gut inputs land differently at 45 than at 25. Implants need a brief antibiotic shield, then a fast handoff to immune-informed healing. If a claim ignores timing, it's probably wrong. Watch endpoints. Bone density shifts slowly. 8-week studies bragging about DEXA are suspect. Trust designs that power for 1 year or more, track site-specific density, include bone turnover markers and log diet, vitamin D, mechanical load, and meds. Strain-resolved metagenomics beats vague diversity. Mechanistic bridges, Rankle, OPG, IL-6, TNF-alpha, circulating short-chain fatty acids, make findings believable. Don't confuse whispers with flames. Low biomass reads in quiet patients with normal labs and imaging aren't infections. Treat patients, not artifacts. Teams that sample bone now bring contamination dashboards, air and glove swabs, reagent blanks, parallel cultures, multiple primer sets, and pre-registered pipelines. If a finding can't survive that gauntlet, it doesn't get to steer care. Hold 2 truths at once. 1. Gut-derived short-chain fatty acids consistently cool marrow immunity, favor OPG, and blunt osteoclastogenesis in animals with human plausibility. Estrogen modulates that bored, and parathyroid hormone's anabolic punch in animals depends on butyrate. 2. Bone-resident tenants, universal probiotic prescriptions, and detailed spatial maps remain promising, not proven. Curiosity without credulity keeps patients safe. Last myth, this replaces orthopedics. No. Steel, sutures, debridement, and drugs save lives and frames. The colony is context, a set of dials that make good care land cleaner. Feed fermenters, time antibiotics, design immune-smart surfaces, and load the frame. That's not a shortcut. That's the difference between luck and repeatable outcomes. The next experiments that could change orthopedics. We've pushed hype to the curb so the right studies can matter. Now let's build the trials that turn quiet signals into standard care. Start with a backbone trial that respects endpoints. Multi-center, randomized, double-blind. 3 populations: postmenopausal adults at elevated fracture risk, athletes in heavy impact blocks, and elders heading for elective joint replacement. Everyone gets standardized counseling on mixed fermentable fiber, protein distribution, calcium, and vitamin D, plus a logged loading plan, so noise doesn't swamp signal. Then randomized to 4 arms: a documented Lactobacillus reuteri strain with proven viability at expiry, Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG, a tributarin postbiotic, or placebo. Primary outcomes are site-specific DEXA at 1 year and fracture incidence tracked 2 to 3 years. Secondary outcomes: bone turnover markers, circulating short-chain fatty acids, Rankle, OPG, IL-6, TNF-alpha. Stool uses shotgun metagenomics, not just 16S, to resolve strains and fermentation capacity. The question is precise. On top of diet and load, does a defined microbial or postbiotic input move density or fractures, and for whom? In parallel, treat perioperative stewardship as an osseointegration variable. Enroll spine fusions and total joints. All get gold standard infection prevention, skin prep, air discipline, on-time incision dose antibiotics. Randomize the tail, standard short course versus the extra safe extended course some centers still use. Layer a peri-op ecology plan. 4 weeks prehab with fiber targets. 1 daily fermented food if tolerated. Vitamin D corrected, protein at each meal, alcohol trimmed, sleep defended. Outcomes are hard and human. Infection rates must be non-inferior, fusion at 6 and 12 months, radiographic loosening, patient-reported pain and function, time to mobilization. Collect stool before, during, and after to watch the gut's choir crash and recover. If short course plus diet preserves integration without raising infection, guidelines shift. Next, see the locals or close the chapter. Build an in situ imaging pipeline for low biomass truth. Elective orthopedic cases consent to pinhead biopsies from non-critical edges. Tissue hits RNase inhibitors within seconds in the OR. Then run parallel assays. RNA scope for bacterial rRNA. Fluorescence in situ hybridization with multiple probes. Confocal stacks aligned to osteocyte lacunae and canaliculi. Nanosims for isotopic hints of metabolism. And Raman for mineral to matrix ratios. Every run travels with air and glove swabs, reagent blanks, and mock extractions. Pre-register pipelines, release contamination dashboards. The deliverable isn't a pretty atlas, it's a reproducible map. Which niches, what density, and what activity signals appear in healthy bone. Healing windows beg for timing tests. Enclosed tibia fractures, randomized standard care versus standard plus a timed postbiotic, low-dose tributarin, starting 48 hours after fixation to respect early sterile inflammation. Primary outcomes. Time to radiographic union by validated criteria. Reoperation for non-union. Return to activity milestones. Mechanistic substudies draw serial blood for short-chain fatty acids and cytokines and, when ethical, sample callus fluid under ironclad controls. If a modest, timed postbiotic shortens union without infections rising, payers listen and protocols update. Test the hormone microbe handshake in humans. Stratify intermittent parathyroid hormone candidates by baseline fermentation capacity using stool metagenomics and a simple breath test proxy. Randomize to parathyroid hormone plus diet counseling versus parathyroid hormone plus diet plus tributarin. Primary outcomes: hip and spine, DEXA, and trabecular bone score at 1 year. Secondary: turnover markers and side effect profiles. Boosting Buta rescues non-responders whose choir runs quiet. Use bed rest as earthbound microgravity. Head-down tilt studies randomize participants to high fermentable fiber menus with controlled fermented foods versus standard rations holding protein and vitamin D constant. Add a probiotic or postbiotic arm. Track bone turnover, site-specific DEXA, immune tone, and metagenomics. It's a clean way to isolate the gut-bone axis under load deprivation. Clinical microbiology needs a readout that isn't a panic button. Develop a whisper index that integrates low biomass signals with clinical context. Combine sequencing counts adjusted by contamination controls, RNA scope positivity, cytokine profiles, and imaging to score likelihood of true infection versus benign whisper. Validate prospectively across implant clinics. If the index separates ghosts from flames, we spare guts and save steel. Finally, demand manufacturing discipline. Trials must pre-register strain identities, dosages, viability at expiry, and release full metagenomics for outside checks. Low biomass imaging protocols should be open sourced with contamination logs. Boards should write stopping rules that protect against unseen infection risk without blocking the chance to preserve helpful cues. If these studies land, checklists change. Diet targets join pre-op orders, antibiotic tails trim, time postbiotics enter fracture pathways, and imaging whispers stop starting wars. That's not biohacking. That's orthopedics, catching up to the room where bones actually make decisions. Your daily skeleton protocol, evidence-based, no hype. Here's your daily build sheet. 25 to 35 grams of mixed fermentable fiber, 1 to 2 fermented foods, protein at each meal, vitamin D checked and corrected, calcium from food or targeted supplements. Train with impact and progressive resistance. Walk daily. Protect sleep. Use antibiotics only when needed. Narrow, timed, and short. Then rebuild the choir. If you trial a probiotic, pick documented strains 8 to 12 weeks. Stop if nothing moves. Tributarin is an adjunct started low with supervision. For surgery, run a 4-week prehab. Fiber, ferments, protein, vitamin D, minimal NSAIDs, standard prophylaxis, early mobilization. Your skeleton is co-managed. Ancient whispers tune the switchboard that tells builders when to work. Want the follow-up trials on implants, fractures, and time postbiotics as they publish? Subscribe and hit the bell. Now watch our Spaceflight Bone episode to see these levers under microgravity.